So welcome. My name is Erin Brennock, and I'm with Synopsys. And I wanted to let you know that you're in for a real treat. I was here for the first session of this, and I have to tell you, the expertise and depth and knowledge of these illustrious panelists, you're really going to enjoy. So I will keep my remarks super brief. I'm with Synopsys. We're a software company that's been around for 30 years here. We have our main business is helping chip designers with their chips and manufacturing their chips and designing their chips. So a very important role in all the devices we have, from our cars to obviously all of our smartphones and all the devices we love. So just so you know, our company, though, we have more than 10,000 employees around the world, but 90% of them are engineers, and a majority of them are master's and PhD engineers. So we started our community outreach years ago with employees who love education, but then we also thought about 19 years ago, what's our strategy? What impact can we make? And remember, we're spending public dollars. We're a public company, so we're spending shareholder dollars. So really, what is our ROI, and how can we benefit the community? So our really easy goal was that we would encourage more students to go into engineering and more engineering degrees here in the United States. So we've sort of changed our tagline. We're now preparing students for life, but we do have science fairs, and we started a science fair foundation 18 years ago. So the good news is we have over 140,000 students and teachers that participate every year. I would say the opportunity gap we have is that we are still in business. And so the fact that we have not put ourselves out of business means we still have a long way to go in preparing, the technical workforce that we need here. And to a certain extent around the world, because we're doing a lot of global work as well. So we are just one tiny program in this very complex system, and both on the state level and the federal level. And so you are in for just a huge treat to hear about what is happening, because the systems are really what make up the work. We can just, add in a little bit from a corporate commitment and a partnership to the students and the teachers and the districts around us. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Fensterwald, the editor-at-large of EdSource, and he will introduce the topic and the great panelists. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you. It's an exciting time to have a conversation about education in California. Education is always important when it involves your child, but some of the changes we'll talk about now will affect a generation of California children, and they're happening now, and they're sweeping, and they involve the shift to the local control, a change in the funding formula, and a new school accountability and improvement system, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Just yesterday, we got the results of the second-year Smarter Balance test measuring students' mastery of the Common Core standards. And it's just a signal, and it's an early signal of whether some of the changes that the state is making are working. And 2 weeks from today, the State Board of Education will vote on a new school improvement and accountability system that's been in the works for more than a year. It's a critical decision, and it will devote most of a conversation today and get time to your questions, and perhaps we'll even be able to touch on the Vergara decision that came out this week regarding teacher tenure and dismissal, and then the High Court's refusal to take on that appeal. So we have a panel today of 4 individuals with different roles and perspectives on the issues, and all of them are thoughtful and have been involved in shaping the policies and implementing them. Michael Kirst is in his 6th year in his second reign as president of the California State Board of Education and emeritus professor of education at Stanford. He is an architect of the local control funding formula that we'll be talking about today. Ann Campbell is superintendent of the San Mateo County Office of Education, a position to which she was first elected in 2010. Before that, she was superintendent of the Portola Valley and Redwood Shores school districts. She began 4 decades of education as a teacher and a counselor. Ted Lempert is president of Children Now, a nonpartisan research policy development and advocacy organization dedicated to promoting children's health and education in California. He served 2 terms in the California Assembly and as a trustee on the San Mateo County Board of Education. And since 2010, Carrie Hanel has been Deputy Director of Research Policy, Analysis, and Practice at Education Trust West, a nonprofit that works to eliminate opportunity and achievement gaps that separate students of color and low-income students from other youth. Before that, she worked for the KIPP Foundation as Director of Research and Evaluation. So to start us off, Mike, why don't you give us an overview of the accountability system that you're working on, why it's important, and how it might work towards improving equity of outcomes for all students.
Well, we're transitioning from a single, quote, academic performance index, which had only test scores, to a much more robust and informative system. The State Board of Education's role is to, in this case, is to implement the law. The local control funding formula law contained many specifications of the accountability system. And it's going to be complex and a challenge to display this clearly to the public. So let's talk about the law. The law had 8 state priorities, including such things as parent engagement and school climate. 8 state priorities. It specified 22 separate metrics that they wanted data on, the legislature, and then we were to break that down by 13 subgroups. So you start doing the math, you get a lot of coverage of a lot of things compared to a test score, single score index. So in working on this, we are going to align to the federal statute, and I stress the statute, not the regulations that have been proposed by the Secretary of Education. They go considerably beyond the statute, and they are still being formulated, and I think some of the federal issues will go into the next administration. So we're aligning to the federal statute, which has 5 top-line indicators, which will serve federal and state level. They include, of course, the test scores. They include the English language learner progress. They include the graduation rate, school climate, and we're doing a composite college and career readiness indicator that is more than just the 11th grade test, but includes A to G, advanced placement, and career indicators of taking sequences of career courses. The system is a mix of state-wide data that's collected in the whole state and will be fed down, and local indicators and local surveys. The locality will cover such areas as school climate, parent engagement. The state role will be to vet these surveys for technical competence so the questions work right. So the locals have variation in some of this, and the state role will be more limited. The whole system is, as I say, under design, and what we're deliberating on, which I think misleads people as to how complex this will end up in the end in terms of public communication, it's like creating a new phone and you're working on the operating system, and it's very complex, and we will take several months after September to design the user end product, the actual phone. And that'll unfold with some of the 5 indicators, and then it'll go deeper and deeper, and presenting that is quite a technology challenge, and we're working on that. Lastly, the system has a sense of continuous improvement. In some ways, for the first year, we're stuck with whatever we collected statewide, so we're going to go for the first year only with suspensions, but then shift over to school climate and drop suspensions, which I think are school climate's a better measure, and so that indicates the continuous improvement. Accountability systems are for many purposes. It's not just for identifying low-performing schools. It is for informing the public about a full array of indicators. You don't want, I don't think any parent would like a parent report card coming home with a single number or grade for your child. You want several more dimensions. So we're moving in that direction, clearly. But you also want your accountability system to inform you about how to help local school districts. And just knowing a test score isn't enough. And so we're really featuring it for assistance as well as intervention. So I'll stop there.
Great. So Ted, Children Now has some strong views on accountability, and I think you're in concert with the state board in terms of its overall intention. But talk a little bit about what your hopes are for the school accountability as it rolls out, and one of the challenges and concerns you may have.
Sure. Well, first of all, there's a lot of big decisions yet to come, but definitely want to applaud Mike and the State Board for what the decisions that have been made, including, I know, for this audience, making sure that when we're talking about accountability, that we're not having the narrow focus we did before on just English language learning and math, but we've included science and NGSS and really broadened out what we're testing. So the board made that very clear at their last meeting, and including the science standards as part of this system, which is crucial. Mike's totally right in terms of meeting several purposes of an accountability system. So I just, at a high level, a couple points. Children Now and many other groups work very hard in the LCF statute to have these multiple measures, to be focused on school climate and parental engagement. And as Mike said, it's complicated, but it's really important that districts are reporting on that and that county offices are overseeing how school districts are doing on all those measures, and it can also help with the continuous improvement. I do just want to highlight, and something that we're very concerned about going forward, another purpose of the state accountability system, and this gets into what's required by federal law, but also the role of the state, and that is to make it really easy and transparent for business leaders, for parents, for everyone to see how your schools are doing. And that's important from an equity point of view and for a multi-billion-dollar public enterprise. And so specifically on that, there were problems with the last system. And we need to identify what the problems were, but not overdo the response to all the problems. So one problem is not only were we just focused on one number and the test scores, but the tests were measuring the wrong thing. It was drill and kill, memorization, multiple choice. What's getting lost in this accountability debate, and it's especially timely given the scores that came out yesterday, is all of us have worked together, educators, business community, to improve those standards. So on Common Core and NGSS, not perfect, but we're now doing a much better job measuring what matters, critical thinking skills, the skills that are needed in today. So when we talk about test scores, people are still talking about the last sets of tests and, oh, these terrible tests measuring the wrong thing. We've really improved them. So that leads to my last point, and that is the state, it's really important as the State Board continues this work, in addition to the very complex measures that you can all dig into, and especially county offices are going to have to dig into overseeing school districts, is to still have a few numbers, composite numbers, that the public can look at to see how their schools are doing. And we're hoping when this all comes together that the state will be able to highlight those on a dashboard. And always, but certainly in the short term, the only apples to apples comparisons we really have are these graduation rates and the test scores. So it's important that we keep a weight on the test scores as we evolve into the multiple measures, and recognize the improvement we've made in terms of how we're testing our kids in a much more sensible way than we were doing, in the last 15 years.
So Carrie, there was mention of the federal system and Every Student Succeeds Act, and so there's a federal requirement for accountability and a state. I think the goal is to create and align the two so that it's not mixed messages the way that we did in the past. But so Mike implied there's some tension, and I wonder if you could give an overview what's going on between the feds and the state, and how do you see it playing out?
Sure. So the Every Student Succeeds Act was signed into law in December 2015. The previous law was many years overdue for reauthorization, was hanging on by a very thin thread. So many of us were happy to see the federal government finally come forward and state what it expects of its states in regards to education. The regulations that implement the law, Mike's right, are not finished, and in some ways do exceed the statute. In some ways they clarify it. So one of the things that's important about ESSA and the federal role is that it ensures fundamental protections for all students, particularly low-income students and students of color. And while the law does return a lot of control to states, it also maintains those important protections. And so as we're implementing in California our LCFF law and developing our accountability system, it's important that we do develop something that's aligned with the federal government, not just for compliance reasons, but because it's really important for the kids who are most vulnerable in our system. And a lot of times those students are lost when we average data together and when we look at big systems, when we look at the performance of counties or districts or the state as a whole, it doesn't really tell us about how individual schools are serving individual students. And certainly the dashboards that we've talked about and the multiple measures will be disaggregated by subgroups. And that's really important. And California has been far ahead on that for years since it implemented its own accountability system back in the 90s. But it's one thing to transparently share data. It's quite another thing to make sense of it for the public and to acknowledge that assistance and interventions have to be tied to performance of individual groups. So for instance, Oakland Unified has some very high-performing, wealthy schools, and it has some schools that are in the flatlands that are, serving many students from poverty. And if we just look at the performance of the district as a whole, even if we're disaggregating by subgroups, we're losing the fact that there might be some schools making tremendous progress with English learners or students with disabilities or students of color, and there might be some schools that are stagnating. That's lost in the averages. And what the Every Student Succeeds Act does is it ensures that we're rushing supports and services to those schools where there are gaps and needs, regardless of how the school is performing as a whole. And I think that's one of the really important areas of alignment that we're trying to ensure happens as we implement LCFF, which is on a great track, but it's not complete. Getting to reporting data is not the same thing as making sense of the data and acting upon the data.
Great, thanks. So Ann, as county superintendent, you oversee 23 districts. And so what will the county's role be in identifying these low-performing schools? And more importantly, what will your role be and how will it change in the new accountability system that stresses continuous improvement and a different relationship, perhaps, that the county has had with its districts? How will that work, and talk about the change?
Well, it's definitely a work in progress at this point in time, and it's interesting to think about individual schools, districts, the county, the state, the federal government, and how we've got all of this going back and forth at this point in time. County offices have always worked well-performing school districts, and we've had, since 1990, the duty of approving local school districts' budgets. So we've been involved in that capacity. But I would say that the new accountability systems gives county offices a pivotal role, and we play a variety of roles within that. One is that as our local school districts are developing their local control accountability plans, we provide them with technical support in making sure that they're addressing all of the different elements that Mike talked about that they really need to be very cognizant of. What I would say about the new accountability plan that Carrie just alluded to is I think one of the things that it has done is it has made our districts much more aware of our unduplicated students, because they very intentionally have to direct the supplemental and concentration funding that they are receiving to those groups of students and write goals based upon data. So I'd say that's a sizable change just right there, and that's huge, and we're all getting used to that. But we flipped from that role of providing technical assistance and support in the development of the LCAP to, on June 30th, when the LCAPs come to the county office, it's our job to decide whether or not they're approvable or not. So we kind of go into that other mode, and it's an interesting dance in terms of how you play that role over the course of the year, because on the one hand, you're providing support, on the other hand, you really are providing oversight and authorization. As we move forward with the evolution of our accountability system and its development, there's another role for county offices to play, and we're probably just nudging into that at this point in time for schools that are low performing. And what the accountability regulations say is that when a school district LCAP isn't approvable by the county office for one reason or another, or they're not meeting their goals and their targets, or if the local board requests it, the county office of education needs to provide technical assistance to that school district to help them get to where they need to be. We've done things like that before. As far as like at our county office, we have a group called Networks for Success that really go in and support low-performing school districts. This is probably going to be a very different way of providing that assistance, and we're just really on the cusp of that. The other institution that's in place now in California as far as technical assistance to school districts is concerned is the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, which you'll hear referred to as CCEE. They also are tasked with providing technical assistance to schools, and I think we're entering into a very interesting era of what is the relationship between our local county offices and the CCEE as we really begin to get involved in the real on-the-ground work in assisting low-performing schools and districts. Last thing I would just say very briefly about continuous improvement, really have gone from an era that's been defined by a single number and you do this or you really suffer sanctions to an era that says we absolutely are going to hold you accountable, but we're going to do it in a way that really stresses your continuing to get better and better and better. So I think that's a welcome breath of fresh air for California public education.
I think one of the shifts will occur after the state board adopts the standards for the various priorities, right, Mike? So you'll have sort of a standard and for graduation rate, what should it be over time, and suspension rates, and what should the scores that you got back, what should be shooting for, and I think that then folds into the local accountability plans, right? So that they should reflect the changes that you see. So it's just not numbers that tell you whether you're doing poorly or not, but it should be reflected in the community's involvement. I wonder how different is this?
Well, that is clearly the idea, and that it would be all the accountability would be connected back to the local control accountability plan, which is we're going to change to a 3-year plan so the districts don't have to do it every year. So really that LCAP, it's called, has been operating with only the front end of it in place, how you're going to spend the money and target it and all that sort of thing, and not the back end of how are you doing. And so that will this cycle will complete the LCAP, both, if you will, the input and the outcome side of the equation, and make the whole LCAP much more whole and complete conceptually.
So we've talked that accountability system itself is just one element of a number of pieces that supposed to fit together, and California is adopting its new academic standards, the Common Core and Next Generation Science Standards. We have a new funding formula that redistributes money particularly for low income and students and English learners, and also a shift to local control, which is really a big change in how we've seen the governance of education. So I wonder, panelists, if you would pick one or two of these aspects and talk a little bit about, after a couple of years, how's it going so far, and what's our, whatever. And particularly I'd like to hear about local control and whether it's working, whether the funding formula is working.
So yes, I think it is working in terms of really getting dollars to students who need those funds to provide academic supports, and that's a good thing. I would say that in public education, we've kind of had all of these things happen to us in the last couple of years that really have been like a tsunami hitting everybody. And I think we're kind of evolving, and we've gone from, whoa, what is all of this, to saying, okay, we're going to roll up our sleeves and really work on it. As I think about the different standards that are out there right now, the new standards, there's the Common Core, there's the Next Generation Science Standards. We're just starting to pivot to the Next Generation Science Standards, and I've been involved with a lot of work on environmental education recently and environmental literacy through a state group that I'm working with. In San Mateo County, we have been pulling together groups of teachers to really digest the next generation science standards, particularly relevant to environmental education, and then say, okay, so how do we translate this into reality in the classroom? And I think that what we're seeing from teachers as we think about the NGSS in that realm is two things. One, and I would say it's true about the Common Core as well, there's really an upswelling of enthusiasm about the standards, because they really allow teachers to teach in ways that they weren't able to do before when they were very prescribed under NCLB what they were striving for. And that's wonderful, and it's really wonderful to see that sense of creativity that's there, that they are excited about. The other part of it, though, that I think it reveals is to really achieve the level of substantive instructional change that needs to happen in the classroom. Teachers need time to work together on that, and they need to go into their classrooms and try out lessons and then come back together as a professional community of practice and say, here's what worked for me. Boy, this one really, you know, what would you suggest I do to make this be a better lesson? We don't have a lot of time built into our systems as they currently operate to provide our teachers with that time. So I would say one of the areas that I think we need to really think about as far as moving forward with the monumental changes that are going on with our new standards is how do we free up time for our teachers to have those communities of professional practice?
Yeah, I would say that the biggest challenge is still that we don't have enough capacity among the teachers and administrative leaders to implement all these curriculum changes. We did a statewide survey of what's going on in Common Core, for example, and the results were very clear that the teachers like the professional development they have been getting, but want and need much more. And I think this is particularly true, for example, in elementary mathematics. I mean, the gap in our Smarter Balance scores between English language arts and mathematics is stark. But we made sort of bigger conceptual changes, I think, in mathematics. We resequenced what grade some of the math is taught in. We're requiring much more application rather than just being able to repeat a formula, much more application in new circumstances. So I think that is an issue. And then the other thing in the survey was, while the teachers were pleading for more help, the administrators thought things were going pretty well, much better than the teachers. So we had this disconnect between the school leadership and the teachers, and we need to really work on that, I think, as as another issue.
So Mike, if continue if you will. So what's the state role here? I mean, is it every district for itself under local control, or is there a state role in dealing with the issue of capacity of teachers and administrators?
Right. So far, there has been really the state working with the counties. So it's a huge state, as we know, and the counties have been a key way that we're working, and we've supported them to do more. There's been a number of teacher networks built, and so on across the state. But here's the opportunity of a preview of coming attractions. The federal ESSA law is loaded with opportunities if the state wants to seize them, and if the locals will consent to the state exercising the withholding, which is in the federal law, to create much more capacity. We can withhold from Title I, for example, 7% of the total expenditures to build capacity or other things, and that's the state's choice. And we could, that in California is about $130 million. So all of a sudden we have the means to do this, and what I want the public and some of our interest groups and so on is to focus much more on the front end, building capacity, and we need to stop talking mostly about just accountability on the back end. But I think you'll see a real debate about this as the ESSA rolls out. So the biggest thing in 2017 will be the state plan for implementing the new federal act. And, you know, we're just going to declare for most of the titles that all the applications that you're now operating federal aid under locally are defunct. You have to apply again, and we're going to come up with new criteria. So that's a preview. But there is something in the offing, and the federal money is categorical. whereas the state money is very flexible. So we're hoping to move on that and enlist help with our allies here.
Interesting. Carrie, Ted?
Well, I just wanted to pick up on the focus on what's the state role. And so, first of all, on the local control funding formula, which certainly on paper and most of the credit goes to then Professor and President Kirst on helping to write and then push through that law. It makes a whole lot of sense. And what it's basically saying is it's removing the categorical programs, and it's saying the state's going to give local flexibility. You know, there needs to be accountability and a real focus on making sure that the kids in most needs, English language learners, foster care kids, kids in intense poverty, are getting extra support. So it's rationalizing the finance system. So when you talk about what else does the state need to do, there's lots of roles, and one is what LCFF, Local Control Funding Formula, did not do was address the size of the pie. So a lot of districts are struggling because the law is saying you've got to focus in on these groups of students, and there's perception that there's all this extra money coming with LCFF. The quote extra money is because the economy is strong. Economy dips again, we're in trouble again with school funding. So the state still funds our schools, whole nother story. And so a huge state role is making sure we have an adequate level of funding in this state, and we might get into that with one of the court decisions. Another huge state role, you know, as Mike was alluding to, is the capacity. I know our keynote speaker who runs Teacher Credentialing Commission, Linda Darling Hammond, the CTC has been doing a lot of great work on that, and there's a lot more to do in terms of making sure we're recruiting and supporting and ensuring we've got great teachers, and that involves our teacher training. So that whole state role on capacity is really, really strong. And then the final issue that I'd highlight that the state needs to play a huge role in is early childhood education, where we have no real strong quality measures and huge, huge gaps in terms of access and quality. And so the state really needs to, we made a little bit of progress, but really needs to prioritize that as well.
Carrie, one of the challenges of local control is we have 1,000 districts, and it's hard to keep track and know what's happening. Ann can tell us what's happening in 23. And I know Education Trust West has done some research into how the money is being used and distributed, and how local control may be working as reflected in the local control accountability documents that Mike mentioned.
Ooh, well, I'll start by saying one of the reasons I think so many advocates are focused on accountability is because these things go hand in hand. The bargain was that we would create more flexibility and send more dollars to high poverty schools in exchange for more accountability. And so being asked to focus on local control and trust that it requires a great leap of faith. And for communities of color in particular, one of the things we hear is that the history of local control has not been terribly favorable to them across all kinds of sectors, not just education. So I think that's part of the reason for the scrutiny on accountability, but it's also one of the reasons that we have looked at the local control and accountability plans and tried to see how the money is being spent. The first finding is simply that the local control and accountability plans, the LCAPs, don't really tell us how the money is spent in a very clear way. It's very, very difficult to track through these documents, and there's certainly lots of opportunity to improve the LCAP process, not the document per se. I mean, I think one of the things we're realizing is that the value in the LCAP is the process of connecting your vision to your goals, to your budget, and that's really a process thing. That's less of a compliance document thing, but we've been so fixated on the compliance tool because it's an easy thing to fixate on. So we've recently stepped back and looked a little bit more at the kind of the fiscal picture, how schools are spending money, to see if local control is working. Are we getting more money to high poverty schools? And that's really the fundamental question. And I think what we're seeing is that, yes, we are, as the economy has improved, we are prioritizing high poverty school districts first. They're getting kind of the first flood of resources. And then with that, there's an increased focus on issues of equity and more investment in low-income students and English learners and foster youth. One of I think the unintended consequences, or the problems with not achieving the adequacy levels that Ted spoke to, is that we see that districts that are not high poverty are feeling a lot of cost pressures. In fact, all districts are continuing to feel cost pressures, but local communities that are not getting the supplemental funding are then turning to local resources like parcel taxes and construction bonds and other things that I'm concerned are essentially dampening the effect of the supplemental dollars in the state system. So yes, state can send additional dollars to high poverty districts, and in turn, affluent districts can raise their own money. And so I think we continue to have this equity issue, and it becomes an adequacy issue that I think is going to continue to be an urgent issue for this state to resolve. In terms of the equity challenge, though, I do think that LCFF has created a conversation about equity that has really been energizing the state. It's continued into the accountability conversation. We're talking about in the context of Common Core, too. How do we reach English learners through the Common Core? How do we train teachers to teach those standards in the context of English language development and ELA together? So I think those things have been really important. There are all kinds of untapped things. We're still figuring out what we do foster youth and building the capacity of counties and school districts to understand what their needs are and how to effectively serve them. So I think that the LCFF has created a roadmap fraught with challenges, but at least it's gotten us heading in the right direction in talking about equity.
So you mentioned that the adequacy issue and local control funding formula, it redistributes money, but it doesn't expand it, as you said, the size of the pie. And this week, the Supreme Court, in a decision, close decision, 4-3, said that it wasn't going to review the issue of adequacy, that basically it's a legislature's job to determine what an adequate level of funding is. And I wonder if you had any of you. Mike, I know you perhaps were sued.
I can. Both of those lawsuits, lawyers have said they may sue again, and so since I'm a defendant, I'm advised by my lawyers not to comment.
We won't go out of this room. Okay.
Comment.
Well, I'd urge you. I'm going to actually plug John so he doesn't have to plug his column himself. You should always read his columns, or read his upcoming columns, where he's going to be highlighting, as he's told me, Goodwin Liu's dissent on both the funding and the Vergara decision. So that makes, I think, very educational reading. But I would just
thank you, Ted.
say that on the adequacy side, I mean, one of the great things about LCFF was the governor and legislature did that work. They weren't forced by the courts to have a more equitable system, unlike New Jersey and some other states. So ideally, even if you were frustrated, like I was on that decision where I think the court could have played a real role in pushing things, it still is in a lap of the governor and legislature, even if the court had ruled the other way. So I think the pressure remains on making sure that we have a education system, that is well funded. And it would have been nice for that decision to have pushed that along, but it's something we all need to work on doing. And one thing I would urge folks to do is compare ourselves to other states. Where do we rank in terms of general government spending, correction spending, local government, education? And what you'll see is California is not putting the resources it needs to into its kids in terms of education, early childhood, and we're not as high as most other states on that regard.
And Karen, and particularly some of your districts are quite well off, but then there are disparities in Santa Clara County in terms of revenue, right?
Yes, I think when you look at both San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, you see the opportunity gap writ large. And in both of our counties, we have some of the most well-funded school districts in the state of California who, when you put their local taxes together with their parcel taxes together with what their foundations are contributing, are able to spend upwards of $20,000 per student. And when you look at our school districts that have traditionally been lower funded, whose communities don't have the capacity to raise funds privately in the way some of our wealthier communities do, you'll see that they may be more in the $12,000, $13,000 per student range. And certainly with the local control funding formula, more dollars are going to our unduplicated students. There is absolutely no question about that, and that's great. But I think we as citizens and adults in this society need to ask ourselves, what is the moral imperative about investing in our children? And particularly in California, which has one of the more robust economies in the entire United States, which means in the entire world, are we really doing right by our kids? Are we investing in kids in the first 5 years in life when 90% of brain development happens? Are we giving them all an equal playing field for when they enter kindergarten? And then once they're in the K-12 system, are we putting a significant amount of our resources into developing all of that talent that needs to be developed if we're going to continue to move forward as a society? And I don't think we ask ourselves those tough questions very often. And I really think as Californians, we need to begin to do that.
So, Mike, you mentioned the federal plan, the state's plan under Every Student Succeeds Act as one of the priorities for next year. And I wonder if you could touch, and then we can talk perhaps about legislative priorities that Ted and Carrie will be looking at. But talk about, I mean, things don't end after September, right? There's a big vote coming up in September where you adopt the framework for accountability, but then there'll be things happening next year, right? We should be aware of and watch.
Yeah, I would say two other things in addition to the state plan. The Public Policy Institute of California is wrapping up a study on the financing in California of special education. In the local control funding formula, we passed on that. It's a labyrinth of its own. It's unfinished business. It's a very large expenditure for school districts. And attacking that financing system, which is very antiquated, much of it goes back to when I was on the board in the 1980s. And so that is going to be, I think, an issue that we'll be looking at. And another one, in addition, is computer science. I think the board will be and the California Teacher Commission will be in an activist role on that. The problem with that, so far as I see it, is there hasn't been any clear sense of what the subject matter is and how it works through the grades. The advanced placement exam was for Java jocks. You had to know a lot of Java. There was nothing for the general student body. So national organizations, including Code.org, will come out with a new design in the end of September for a K-12 computer science curriculum. And I think that can begin to launch it. We still are working with the University of California Regents to recognize computer science as more essential. They have it as an elective. They say there's not enough science in it to make it science, and there's not enough math in it to make it a math course. So therefore, it's an elective, and so that's an ongoing battle. But that's another area we'll be working on.
Carrie, issues you'll be looking at?
I think we're going to be focused a lot on issues of implementation. And so the accountability, the state plan is certainly part of it, but I think the conversation now on that front shifts from what do we measure to what do we do with what we measure. So the meaningful differentiation and identification of schools leading to a conversation about what that looks like. So if a school has been identified as needing intervention or assistance, how does that fold into the local control and accountability plan? How does the county or the school district provide that assistance? What kind of support do they get? I think there's just a lot of unresolved issues of implementation with our existing legislation that we'll probably be focused on, as well as continued implementation of the new ELD standards, the Common Core and NGSS standards, and then figuring out some of the challenges and opportunities with assessment related to each of those. I think that it's worth scrutinizing the results of the assessments, especially for English learners, especially the ELA assessments, to figure out what's going on there, what kind of language supports we're providing, and then also really thinking about those new science tests and making sure that we're thinking differently and outside the box about what science assessment looks like in California.
Well, ditto to Carrie. I can appreciate Mike calling out the computer science issues. So in addition to some of these teacher issues we've talked about at the state level, the other that I would add is certainly on the early childhood side. We in addition to pushing towards a longer-term plan to really make sure we've got access to quality support at childcare and in preschool, that as we move along, and this includes next year, we've got to continue to provide more support. The legislature and governor did a good job this year on some child care funding, but that's going to be another huge priority next year, and the leadership group and others have played a big role in that. The one other legislative issue I'd mentioned goes back to local control funding formula, and we have two folks right here on the panel that could help figure that out. And I think it's really important that the legislature and governor work over the next couple of years to ensure that LCFF stays in place for the next administration and beyond. And I don't think there needs to be wholesale fixes in terms of the state policy, with one exception, maybe this county office role, whereas Superintendent Campbell was highlighting there's a real tension with county offices between providing support and also holding their districts accountable. So I think from a state policy level, we might want to look at that in the next couple of years and make sure that county office role is more clarified, because now I think the state's sending mixed signals to counties.
Do you see how that might be clarified, Ann?
I'm hoping it will be clarified, but we'll have to see. We're all in new terrain here. I do think as we move forward into the next year, as the state board takes its action to adopt the new rubric for the LCAP, and as we're looking at a new template for the LCAP, from the county office perspective, that means that we need to work even more closely with our districts, because they're going to be making the transition to another way of putting their plans together. The other thing that I was thinking about in terms of this group here today and who's in the audience, one area that I think it's not necessarily legislative, but one thing that I think is an issue for schools that would be a good area to explore potential partnerships between our two areas is in the whole area of data analytics. And Carrie certainly made reference to the fact about drilling down into your data, and it tends to show something different than what you may see at this level. That's not always an area that schools have a great deal of expertise in, and certainly from our county office perspective, we've been actually working with a learning analytics group that started as one person and has grown to 5 in our county office, because we're really trying to help our districts get that expertise with really understanding their data. But I think that's a way that we could, as educators, really benefit from working together with the private sector. So as I look to the year ahead, that's something I would be interested in having more conversations about.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'm glad you talked about partnerships which are possible under local control. So we have a couple minutes. I wonder if your questions in the 10 minutes that remain. There we have a mic, too. And if you don't ask them, I will. So, anybody questions? Any thoughts? Questions on anything you've heard? Okay. While you're thinking, oh, please. Sorry.
I know the governor and the state legislature has put a lot of money into education, and there's been tremendous cuts to foster care, to health care, and so they're really putting the burden on the community leaders and staff to really move the needle on the gap. Now, we have all this extra, I guess I wouldn't call it extra money, but we're not even in restored levels from the previous recession, but that's a lot of stress on the system when you don't really have adequate funding, yet you're expected to move the needle on basic skills and on the gap. And could you please address it? Sometimes I feel, I've been in education for many years, and I feel we study, but we're not moving the needle. I don't know. Could you comment?
Yeah, one comment on that would be just to straighten out this record that we haven't recovered from the recession. If you take Alum Rock in East San Jose, a local elementary district, their per pupil expenditures are up 50% in the last 4 years. So it depends what districts you're talking about, and to me, the local control funding formula was to get all districts beyond where they were before the recession. So I think districts are hit with declining enrollment, and that's a problem. But that's more of that's not something we can really deal with. But that's not your basic point. But I just wanted to clarify the record that there have been some very dramatic increases. If you look at this, and I'm somebody that sees a lot of the budget, not just education, and talks with the governor a lot. So I don't know how any new governor could put that much more high priority on K-12. It has really gotten a very large proportion of the budget. Ted could comment on this in the legislature. They just think other areas are even more shortchanged than education, and we've been getting it. Higher education, which I've now written 2 books on, and have just finished a book on higher education in the Silicon Valley, they've been cut more and recovered a lot less than K-12. Child care is in worse shape than K-12. I think all would admit that. We have increased health expenditures by billions. So most of the money's gone into K-12 education and health. And you're not likely to see a better period of revenue growth than we had coming out of 2011. It's about as good as it's going to get in terms of state revenue growth. So to me, it's not a matter of internal allocation within the state budget. It's a matter of overall lack of revenue, and that's despite the fact that we passed Prop 30 and really hit high income tax earners a lot harder than they'd ever been hit. So I think you're really looking at the revenue side of it, and you know, I would go back to the secret of the states that spend twice as much as we do. My home state, Pennsylvania, not a wealthy state, spends 80% more than we do, and they have a 3-legged funding system: federal, state, local. We basically have a 2-legged system: federal and state, with locals able to work around the margins with property tax. In the old days, and I'm old enough to remember, you know, when we had local property tax authority, everybody tended to drift up to the county average. So some would get ahead, and then others would raise their property taxes to get to the local average. So I don't, that's one possibility of a revenue source. Extending sales taxes beyond just hard goods to some services is another. But I don't think we're going to get that far with higher priorities. And as another thing you mentioned is that the pension costs are going up, and that's eating into your general revenue as well. So, and I don't know what we can do about that either. So,
No, thanks. Are you sure you don't want to talk about that adequacy suit?
yeah.
Ted, K-12 doesn't talk about pre-K, and I know that's an issue of yours.
Yeah, well, so 2 points. Just agree and slightly disagree with my mentor on that. And then we talked about data and analytics, and I think it really is important to look at per capita spending by government program across the country. And we are a relatively high-tech state. I would still, as Mike's saying, that the state government is what funds the future. It's the primary funder of education. So we need to significantly figure out a way to increase funding for early childhood. I mean, huge gaps where some families in this region, tens of thousands of dollars are being spent for their kids per year, birth to 5. Other kids are getting nothing. So the state has to play a huge role there, and in K through 12 and in higher ed. So first of all, the state government, if you think government spends too much money, don't go after the state, because the state's the engine of the future, funding education. But in terms of prioritization, if you look nationally, we rank much higher on other services than we do in education. So there is some reprioritization that can definitely occur, so we can match more up with other states. The one other piece I'd say, Mike mentioned federal, and the federal government can do a lot more for providing support for education, certainly special ed. Locally, the city of San Francisco and city of San Jose put dollars into their school system. The city government, the mayors have said, kids are priority, we're going to fund it. And so as Mike's indicating, the state can't do this all alone. And I think every local government in this region, obviously most cities, the other cities are smaller, but we need to all be in this together. And city services, city employees do a lot better than schools. So we really need every city and counties to step up and say, how do we all work together providing support for schools? San Francisco City does it, San Jose does some support, and all cities need to help and work more closely with their schools on providing support.
I would really agree with that. I think one thing that I have learned over the last couple of years with something called the Big Lift that we're doing in San Mateo County, where we're really working on being sure that our kids get access to quality early education, as well as several other initiatives, is we tend to operate in public education in the silo of we're the K-12 system. And then there's the preschool system. And there's the city government over there, and there are the nonprofits over there, and there's the philanthropic groups over here, and their volunteers over here. I think that we all need to come together and invest our human capital in addition to our state resources that are coming in the forms of dollars is how do we work smart together? And we don't tend to have a lot of those conversations. And what I would say from the work that we've been doing in the Big Lift is we've been bringing those groups together and the private sector. There's a real focus and an ability to target in a way that you can't when you're working in isolation.
One last quick question, if there is one. Okay.
So I'd like to ask a question. You mentioned briefly Prop 30. I'd like to get a sense of how important Prop 30 was to address a lot of these funding issues, and how's it looking for Prop 55 this year?
Can you comment on how it looks? Yeah.
It's looking good in the polling. A lot depends on turnout, and this is the extension. It actually goes back to what Mike was saying, in that the state government is the funder of education. Very little of a school district's budget comes locally, as I mentioned, or from the feds. The state's where it's at. So if Prop 55 doesn't pass, then the schools are not going to get as much support. If the economy goes down, we really get hit. So the polling is pretty strong at this point, but you know, at least from Children Now's perspective, it's really, really important that that measure passes.
Yeah, I think it was, Prop 30 was obviously vital in the increases we've had. It's still a fairly small increment. Some of the money went to higher education, which was important in that regard. So I think if 55 did not pass, yeah, we'd be back to level funding. I think that's what we would, and that's where we would revert. With probably very little cost of living increases. So that means as district costs go up, pensions go up automatically. They would level state funding means they're going to be cutting services and paying retirees. Yeah.
Final thought, Ann, Carrie. Thank you for your attention, and thank our panel.
Thank you to our speakers for this informative discussion. Let's give our panelists another round of applause for their work today. We also want to give a very special thank you to Synopsys for helping to sponsor this panel. That's much appreciated. Our keynote address by Linda Darling-Hammond begins in 10 minutes right here, promptly at 11:15.